Kia ora koutou, ko Tiffany taku ingoa, he kaireruku tauwhainga aho ki Manaki Whenua. Good morning everyone, my name is Tiffany and I am the Events Coordinator at Manaki Whenua Landcare Research. A lot of you have joined us previously for a webinar session, but before I hand over to Christine, I'm going to run through a couple of technical slides to ensure that your experience with us online today goes as smooth as possible. If you are new to our LINKOnline sessions, bear with me for a minute while I give you a quick intro tour to our webinar platform. You will notice you have a control panel at the side of your screen. If at any time this collapses, you can bring it back by simply clicking the orange arrow button. If you are having sound issues and you can see my mouth moving but cannot hear a word I'm saying, please grab the PDF in the handout section, and this has instructions to resolve this quickly. The audio panel is where you can control where the sound plays on your computer. Select the drop-down arrow and choose your audio output. During the presentation, you may have questions that you want to be covered in our Q&A session. You can do this via the chat panel throughout our session today. You will notice it is pretty small and it will be hard to read other attendees' questions. Select the pop-out icon on this panel and drag the corner out to make it as big as you want. You can also use this feature if you're having technical issues and ask me any questions. Questions asked by the audience show as anonymous and a green colour in the chat panel. However, please note we will use your name in the Q&A session. If I respond to you regarding a question, this will show as read. Now over to Christine to introduce you to our 10th LINKOnline session.
Kia ora and welcome from sunny Wellington today. Today we're talking about wilding conifers, undoubtedly one of New Zealand's worst weeds. The team will present information from a research program called Winning Against Wildings that's now in its 4th year and delivering results that are translated into action through the New Zealand Wilding Conifer Group and the National Wilding Conifer Control Program. This webinar will give you the big picture on this work and provide an introduction to a specialist webinar series that will be established by the Wilding Conifer Group. There'll be more information about the new webinar series in the follow-up email, so do look for that if this is a specialist area of interest for you. Our presenters today are Dwayne Peltzer. Dwayne is the research lead for the collaborative Winning Against Wildings research program and a senior plant ecologist at Manaki Whenua Landcare Research. He's joined by Rowan Sprague, who coordinates the Wilding Conifer Group. The group raises awareness of the wilding issue nationally and provides advice and support for community groups tackling wilding conifers in their area. Just a quick reminder, if you have any questions, do try and get them in early, and we will try to respond as many as we can. Rest assured all questions will be answered, even if we don't get time for them in this session itself. So let's get started. Over to you, Dwayne and Rowan.
Kia ora koutou, and thank you so much, Christine and Tiffany, for that introduction. So today, Dwayne and I will be talking about New Zealand's worst weed problem, also known as wilding conifers. And so really, I will give the introduction to this talk and basically kind of set the scene, and then I'll hand over to Dwayne, who will give a bit more details about the Winning Against Wildings program and what that program is doing. So I thought I would start off by talking about basically just a definition of what are wilding conifers. So wilding conifers are self-seeded and self-established pines or conifer trees, which are growing where we don't want them to grow. So they are the wrong tree in the wrong place. And here you can see in this picture, this is of Jolly's Pass near Hamner Springs. You can see these kind of bright green conical shaped trees, which are basically overwhelming this landscape. So these are wilding pines. And when wilding pines invade an area, they drastically alter the ecosystem functions. So they alter the soil nutrient cycling and the hydrology. So they're really a disruptive weed. And so they're a big problem, and they've been a big problem for decades. So because of that, community groups and regional councils have been controlling wilding conifers for many, many years. So in this on the left-hand side photo, this is the Wanganui and the Hutt Valley tramping clubs on the slopes of Mount Ruapehu. And since the 1960s, they have been scouring the slopes, searching and pulling up wilding pines. This is just an example of just one of the efforts that's been going on to try to control wildings. However, in spite of all these efforts, the status quo management hasn't actually successfully controlled the spread of wildings. So you can see in this exponential graph, just that area that wildings affect has been going up really quickly over time. So this is basically up until about 2015. And so we found that without management, an area could be or the areas across New Zealand could be totally overwhelmed, and at least 25% of New Zealand could be affected by wilding conifers in 30 years. So this was kind of by the time around 2015, 2016. However, in 2016, the National Wilding Conifer Control Program was formed. So this is basically the structure of that program. And I'm not going to go over it too much, but basically the National Wilding Conifer Control Program is here to help coordinate management efforts. So there's a lot of different agencies involved in this. It's a partnership approach. And really what I'd like to point out on this structure is basically kind of two of the boxes. So one is in the lower right-hand corner, that's the Winning Against Wildings box. So the Winning Against Wildings is what we're going to be talking about today. And this program works closely with the Technical Advisory Group of the National Program. So that's a really key implementation pathway for us. So the other group I'd like to point out is the group in the purple box on the right-hand side. So that is the New Zealand Wilding Conifer Group. So we are an independent advocacy and advisory group, basically to connect with stakeholders and help with information sharing. And just before I hand over to Dwayne, I'd just like to point out as well that this year in Budget 2020, the National Wilding Conifer Control Program was allocated $100 million. So this is basically a recognition of the significance of the issue. And we're working through basically how we're going to be allocating that money across the regions. But again, there's a lot of opportunities for basically applying research. So I'll go ahead and hand over to Dwayne, who will be providing a bit more of a background to the Winning Against Wildings program and an overview of what the program is doing.
Yeah, thanks, Rowan. Kia ora, everyone. Rowan kept it on time, so I've got extra time to talk. This is great. So a lot of you obviously will be aware of wilding conifers. You may have heard of it. Some of you may work directly on it. So we'll just take a step back that actually this isn't an exclusively New Zealand problem. This multi-panel picture basically shows lodgepole pine invading lots of places and in its home range. And I dare you to pick which ones are New Zealand, which ones are Europe, and which ones are North America. So why are they global invaders? And it's partly because there's a range of benefits that people had, food, fiber, not food for conifers, sorry, but fiber, shelter, and so forth. So they're widespread forestry species. They've been introduced, and particularly in the Southern Hemisphere, they found a very good niche, if you like, for establishment. Some of the plantings have invaded, and so one of them would be this middle top panel here. This shows Craigieburn, and that's actually lodgepole pine sort of smeared across it. But other ones, top left and top right, are actually plantations in Europe. And up until a few years ago, we didn't think those invaded. It turns out they're just doing it more slowly than what's happening in the Southern Hemisphere. So, yep, the global invaders. New Zealand leads the way, though, in a lot of the management and so forth, which we'll get to in a minute. So we might go to the next slide, Rowan. So a generalized way to look at this for a lot of invasions is a so-called curve. Now, on the back of COVID, everybody's used to flattening the curve. That wasn't the sales pitch originally for the program, but it was basically as time proceeds, the invader goes up and eventually plateaus. And with wilding conifers, there's a set of species, and it depends on which species and where, whether you're early, first invasions, a few seedlings, there's a whole lot of research and management of that. As invasion proceeds, abundance goes up, or population size, and eventually it plateaus. And that's where you can get to intractable places like the branch lethem that are basically closed canopy introduced conifer forest. So part of the motivation for this program, and a lot of the work that we'll highlight in the webinar series, is there is no one understanding at early, mid, or late. You basically need to work across that curve. And equally, there's no one control tool or management approach that works at all stages. So if you actually do want to flatten the curve over on the right, it actually takes an integrated approach, and that's really what we were targeted with in this program. All right, next one. So I guess invasions in New Zealand, most people are well aware of them. I mean, as an island nation, we're well keyed up for biosecurity issues. We look at responses to bovis, to tree diseases, to COVID, and so forth. So in some ways, tackling wildings taps into our biosecurity awareness. And so there is actually quite a lot of work in this area that we'll just cover superficially here, really. But if we look over on the right in those pictures, it's the rate that we go from early to late in the curve, or sort of what's the problem with a seedling? Maybe not a lot, but it very quickly goes to the bottom right, which is closed canopy introduced forest in some places. All right, so we'll go to the next one. So a lot of that is premised on information. Can we just take overseas data and apply it in New Zealand? So things like, how quickly do trees grow? Do they produce seeds? How far do they go? And what is the risk? It turns out we can't do that. And we'll show a few slides, just data slides, to say, no, we can't just take overseas information and apply it in New Zealand, unfortunately. So right, we'll go to the next one. So don't worry about the colors and all the different things. This is a summary of, because some of these species invade lots of different countries, we can compare notes or collect comparative data. So what this is for lodgepole pine, it's a set of countries both in the North and South Hemisphere. And what's really interesting about this is amazing to me as an ecologist. I look at this and say, what's going on? So the orange figures that are the highest are New Zealand. All the other colors are Argentina, Chile, the United States, and so forth in the home range. On the bottom, what we have is age of trees from 0 to 20. So these are fairly young trees. And on the left, it's the size of those trees, the diameter. And on the right panel, it's the cones, which is basically how much seeds do they produce. And basically what we've got is trees in New Zealand growing 2 to 3 times faster than anywhere else and producing at least twice as many cones for the same age. So immediately there's a question, well, why is that? And no, we wouldn't want to take data from someplace else and apply it here because we'd be woefully underestimating the problem. Right, we'll go to the next slide. Now, one thing about wilding conifers, we focus on the green stuff. So there's trees, but the things are associated with the trees. So again, there's been a body of work about who co-invades, and in particular, ectomycorrhizal fungi. So they can help with things like disease resistance, tree growth, and so forth, or their establishment. And the story gets one step more complicated in that these fungi are invasive in their own right. So you get trees, you get co-invading fungi. Then there's a third party that's involved here, which is some of the introduced animals. So we've got possums and deer that we've studied that move fungi around. So you've actually got a trophic, multi-trophic invasion of trees benefiting from co-invading fungi, and those fungi are moved around by animals. So we're not just getting invasion by trees, we've got a complex system that's changing. And that's partly why the integration in the program. Right. So on to management. Clearly, as Rowan alluded to, there's been a ramping up and coordination of management efforts. Some of those involve removals at different stages in the invasion process. So we can talk about places like on the top left where we don't want any invasion, and that's diligently weeded, if you like. Then there's things where invasions happen and we control them at different levels. And eventually it may be it's gone late, but now we're doing a late removal. Those, as an ecologist, are great because they're removal experiments. And we can use them to disentangle what's the impacts of these weeds, what's legacies do they leave below ground, what might come next. And those are some of the questions that we're trying to resolve. So we'll go to the next one. So yeah, some of the questions, some of the sort of data, I suppose, that we want to talk, really follow up in future webinars is, well, what impacts and legacies are the wildings have? There's quite a few. Initially, it was around pasture, water balance, and so forth. There's also diversity effects, and there's longer term things that we might talk around fire regimes and landscape transformations. Another way to pitch it, though, is one of the benefits of spending funding on control or these control efforts. And again, these are well articulated, but probably worth sharing. Okay, next one. Something we're not focusing on here, but as a a major part of the work is just the control methods themselves. And so again, if we look at the curve early, mid, late, it's sort of paralleled in, well, what can you do about those invasions? So early on, it's about detection. How can we find those first invaders? Is there a way to map that? That helps you say, how well is containment working? Control itself is a major emphasis in the national program and the group that Rowan coordinates, the Wilding Conifer Group. So, and there is no one control method. And so that involves volunteer groups weeding. That might involve the classic shortcutty things like grubbers, chainsaws. There's chemical control of different types. Some of it involves helicopters. So there's an awful lot of work putting into how do we refine that or expand the toolbox. If we go up to the right, then there's also a body of work that's about how do we prevent future invasions. And those are ranging everything from where are plantations in the landscape, where might they disperse to, and also can we create trees that produce less problems in the future. So I guess if we take a bit of an overall view of the program, I know this is kind of a superficial going over the top of an awful lot of work that we'd love to share, but it's basically how can we better manage landscape scale invaders? Conifers certainly are that. These are just some illustrative photos. This is up the Clarence River, edge of Molesworth and behind Henmer Springs, for those of you who know the area. And what's amazing is A, the speed of the invasion, B, just how much there is in some areas. So where do you start? You can see a brown patch in the middle. That's a spray trial. And so there's constantly things being done to tinker. It's basically an adaptive management. What can we do to contain and remove these? But ultimately, we bump into all sorts of debates, and this is where things sort of daisy chain to the next thing is, well, what sort of landscapes do people want? Is this seen as valuable or not? So there's an awful lot around the biology and the management, but eventually you bump into why do people care about this? And again, there's some really interesting results from surveys. There's also some economic arguments, cost benefits of doing these things. And there's also, well, what do we want longer term out of landscapes? Not just wildings, but again, other values or benefits. So let me go, we're just about there. So what's really interesting is when you try to put it in context, you say, well, there's this work going on, understanding the ecology and the impacts of the invaders. There's lots of work about its control and management, but then do people see this as valuable? And so something that's been running for a few years is a survey of rural decision makers. And this is in part asking people, do they care? Do they see this as valuable? Are they aware of wildings? And it's run for several iterations. And so if you ask it, there's basically lots of regional variation. That's the colors in the map. But also there's an increasing awareness through time. Okay, so I guess wrapping up or summarizing this, yeah, wilding conifers are a major issue. We've given you a few things that you may want to find out more, but certainly they're a national issue. They've been growing, and there's been a accelerating response to that. We've given you just a few highlights to say, well, there are major efforts underway. Some of these we want to share, but it's premised on coordination. And to me, this is one of the exciting aspects of it is it isn't one agency, one research organization. There's a very much coordinated effort and a partnership that's been developed. I think that's really exciting and worth talking more about. So I could hand it over to Rowan just to introduce what we'd like to do next, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Yes, yeah. So Christine mentioned this at the beginning, but our plan is to basically branch off from the LINKOnline seminar series and kind of basically start a Wildings webinar series. So the next one is going to be on the 12th of August at 11 a.m. by Tom Etherington, and he'll be talking about his species distribution models of various wildings to look at invasion risk. And one of the things that he has found so far, just to kind of as a teaser for what's to come, is that the data that we have about locations of wilding species isn't super great. And so it's basically about how we can use models to inform where our efforts should be for looking for wildings. So yeah, I think that pretty much wraps up wraps up the webinar. Yeah, so I'd love to take questions.
Right, and Rowan and Dwayne, we've got some great questions coming in, so let's crack straight into them. Venice Comfort has asked, by prevention, I think this one's for you, Dwayne, by prevention, do you mean genetic manipulation to avoid trees becoming fertile in the first place?
Oh, now, how long do we want? There's a few different
Might be
approaches.
another whole
There's
seminar.
no one method. So there's certainly gene editing being funded by the forest owners, by SCION, that's the agency leading the work. And so that's a long-term goal. It's not an immediate thing, but there's low spreading genotypes. So there's traditional breeding where some populations, particularly of Douglas fir, have less spreading ability or produce fewer cones. And so it could be traditional breeding as well. And then there are things like, could you locate plantations or so forth in less risky parts of the landscape, and you use things like wind modeling to inform, well, where would spread likely to be from those, and can we minimize that? So there's a few different ways to tackle that sort of prevention area.
Right, I'm sure we'll note that topic for a specialist webinar in the future. This one's a little bit more general. Sandra Villard is asking, is most of the area invaded in the South Island covering earlier ecosystems or forestry ecosystems? And if so, what are the implications for native forest restoration?
Would you like to talk to that one, Rowan?
Yeah, I was just trying to think. I mean, I think in the South Island, a lot of the areas invaded are grasslands. Grasslands are particularly vulnerable to wilding invasions. But yeah, there are certainly areas in the South Island and the North Island where wildlings are invading basically regenerating native bush. And so in those areas, there actually is a big opportunity to control the wildlings and basically let nature do what it was already doing and basically revert back to native forest. But I think it really does depend on the climate of the area and the surrounding seed source as well. So in those grassland ecosystems which are being invaded, it actually is really hard to restore those back to a native grassland. So yeah, that's one of the things which we're kind of working through right now.
Right,
so I
and
could
this
add
might...
to that. Oh, sorry. Yeah, there's definitely more work needed on that because we don't fully understand the successions themselves or what comes after management. So the focus has been on flattening that curve, but then the debate is what comes next and what's desirable for people, and that may be restoration, that could be pasture. There's a number of endpoints, and so again, that's something to be done next.
Thanks, Dwayne. This seems like a related question to me. Katerina Tawari has noticed that near where she lives, there's a large block of land that's been planted in pines or conifers, and it's right opposite some dockland. Is there any regulation on what a private person can plant?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we do have the National Environmental Standards for Plantation Forestry. So this regulates where a plantation forest can be planted. And in that legislation, there is the Wilding Conifer Risk Calculator. So that does take into account the species and the surrounding land use. This calculator isn't perfect. And so actually one of the pieces of work which is going on in the Winning Against Wildings program is there's a group of researchers looking at the spread risk and the establishment risk of various species. And so the plan is that we'll be using this research to actually inform the Wilding Conifer Risk Calculator and improve it so that we don't get the wrong tree growing in the wrong place. Yes, that's the, yeah, but it definitely is an ongoing issue. Yeah, so and we are kind of trying to work through the regulations and the policy to make sure that they're robust enough so that we can actually do something and prevent wildings from happening in the future.
Thanks, Rowan. Look, I've got two related questions here. First of all, Dan Tompkins is checking in to ask, Dwayne, what do you think are the key outcomes from the program in terms of improving management And then I've got a follow-up question for Rowan.
Boy, how long do we want, Dan? That's good. You know, obviously with these programs, there's a lot of intended outcomes from them. Some of them are immediate and some of those are much longer term. So I guess the most immediate things, if I'm being honest, for the managers are about spray efficiencies, they're about the management tools themselves. And so there's an awful lot of work directly to things like good practice guides for handling herbicides. It's things like, could we actually reduce the active chemicals used? Are there alternative systems like autobooms and helicopters or UAVs that could automate, take out some of the human risks? So I guess the most proximate tangible things are about improving the actual techniques of management. And so there is a body of work on that. There's the longer term things that we mentioned, sterile trees and others, plantation design and so forth, and the risk calculators. So some of those are very tangible tools that are being used, and we're feeding the data information results into that. Some of the fundamental ecology ecosystem type approach that I deal with, it's actually a little bit harder to show how that matters immediately, but it is around the benefits of doing the management. So if you manage early, what have you prevented from happening in terms of loss of biodiversity? And when we do things like surveys to say, why do people care? It's actually shifted slightly through time. And I don't want to make a big meal of it, but it is a whole lot of reasons. There's no one reason people want to manage. It could be for protecting pasture and water. That was some of the original arguments. And again, we've got data to back up some of those cost benefit analyses around that. And that actually at least helps to attract some of the funding for the operations. On the back of the surveys, though, there was an awful lot of protecting special places and species, and that it's an urgent problem. And so again, we've got data to say, well, what is it you're protecting? How well is that protection done by managing wildings? And so there's actually quite a few ways, and happy to discuss further with anybody as well. It's a great question.
And here's the follow-up question. Does anyone have a comprehensive list of the initiatives and ways that people are learning to tackle wilding pines, and who to contact for people who might want to get involved? Rowan, I suspect that's for you.
Yeah, that's a really good question as well. And so it does depend, I suppose, at what level you'd like to get involved. So if you'd like to get involved as a volunteer, please contact me. I think I would be hopefully the best person to contact to put you in touch with a community group who are in your area, because there are community groups who are basically working across New Zealand. There's a lot of work going on and a lot of really exciting and passionate people and efforts. But yeah, in terms of the best way to actually control wildings, that's probably something that the National Wilding Conifer Control Program will be able to best answer. So they've been putting together these good practice guides, which Dwayne mentioned. And so that would be probably your best kind of go-to resource, just in terms of how to control the wildings. Yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Okay, and links to those resources will come through in the email that will follow this. I think we've got time for one more, and I'm hoping this won't be a super long one, but maybe it will lead into another webinar. Dwayne, you mentioned that there are implications for soil nutrient cycling when conifers invade. Can the soils be returned to normal once the conifers are removed? And do we know how long that would take?
Yes, it's a very good question, and I could strongly suggest to people to follow up a webinar on that. So long story short, we say there's biogeochemical disruption. So we know there's things like phosphorus that's mostly recalcitrant. Pines come along with a co-invading nectar mycorrhizae and actually speed up those nutrients. So you can imagine that that would dampen through time if you put other species in the system. But we're talking 5, 10, 20 years, not this year. Overseas, there's lots of restoration that add carbon to try to lock in nutrients that we haven't really trialed. But again, if we're removing conifers, we've got dead trees, there are some places where those are being mulched or treated. So we can imagine there's lots of opportunities for what would you do to ameliorate soils for restoration or other things. You know, Ian Dickey, Sarah Sapsford at Canterbury are actually working specifically on legacies. And so really they're people who I would ask to give a webinar about legacies. And they do have some things like past control efforts 1, 2, 5, 10 years ago how long can you detect effects of having done those removals at some point in the past? And it all depends what thing you care about. Some things are restored quickly, other things can persist for a decade or longer. Probably the biggest thing, and what I might end up was this: once a system's invaded, it's more likely to be invaded the second time around. And so actually that's where prevention and containment is really important. So some of that again is mycorrhizae and so forth. So there's basically a bank of spores in the soil that persists, and it means the next generation of trees is more likely to establish. So some of those things tell you about how important it is to prevent the invasion in the first place.
Right. On that kind of note of urgency about the importance and the long-term prospects of this issue, I think that's probably a good point to finish this particular webinar. If you have attended this, you'll be on the list for Rowan's next Wildings webinar series. And do feel free to pass that on to your friends and colleagues as well who are interested in this topic. The next in our series of link webinars will be back to the topic of soils, and that's on the 18th of August. So you'll be informed about that one too. And we look forward to seeing you again sometime soon. Thanks very much.